Hey everyone, I'm Kathrin Maki and I am at the University of Florida. I'm going to kind of moderate our session today. My dog has come and joined us, so hopefully he behaves during the session. I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves. And then once we do that, the plan is I'll start off with the questions that folks submitted ahead of time and pose some of those to the panelists, but also feel free to ask follow-up questions that you have in response to things that the panelists say, either in the chat, I'll be monitoring the chat, or also out loud once the panelists stop speaking. So Kristy, do you want to start us off and introduce us or introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Kristy Brann. I'm an assistant professor in my 5th year at Miami University. And so that's an R2. And the types of funding, I can speak to the perspective as a co-PI on grants. And I have one from SSSP, the Early Career Research Award with Joni Splett. I have an Officers Grant Award from the William T. Grant Foundation with Shireen Nasser out of Cleveland State. And then a big implementation project through the Ohio Department of Education. And again, I'm working with the Center for School-Based Mental Health here at Miami. So I kind of have the perspective from an R2 and as a co-PI.
Awesome, thanks, Kristy. Dave, do you want to go next? I'm just going in alphabetical order by last name.
Sure. My name is Dave Klingbeil, and I am a longtime assistant professor. I'm currently at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I have had experience as a PI and co-PI on IES grants, as well as some internal grants, but I can speak a little bit to the grant demands and process at larger R1 universities.
Thanks, Dave. And Amanda.
I'm Amanda Sullivan. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota. Right now, I have 2 active OSEP training grants, one at the doc level, one at the specialist, along with a specialist one that just sunsetted. And I've had research funding from the U.S. Department of Health, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Foundation for Child Development, and then smaller grants from a few different professional associations.
Hey, thanks, guys. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive in with some of the questions. And like I said, if you guys have follow-up questions, feel free to chime in with those. And I think for Amanda, Kristy, and Dave, whoever, you guys can jump in with however you guys want to kind of respond as far as order goes to these questions. So the first question I wanted to start with is one that someone submitted about having never submitted an external grant or written or submitted an external grant, and knowing that there may be an "it depends" answer to this question. Where do you start? How do you start thinking about submitting an external grant? Broad, big question for you guys.
So I'll start, I guess. So I recommend approaching it as you would like any new skill. So taking time to learn about kind of the area, seek mentoring or coaching, and depending the type of grant you're interested in, there's going to be books, archived webinars, workshops, blogs, consultants, and in addition to a variety of internal supports at your university. Or you could even like dip into other universities and access that stuff, because like where I am, between the research office, the sponsored projects office, the library, there are like literally dozens of different services and supports designed to get people started, to help them find funding, to provide examples of funded projects, to link them up with potential grant reviewers. Like there might be people within your office, within your university, who have either been funded or served on review panels for the different agencies that different folks within your university can link you up with, or who are able to provide information. And so I think you can don't just jump in and start writing with no exposure to any of that stuff. There's so many different ways that you can learn about how to do it effectively.
Dave or Kristy, anything you guys would add?
I can go next. Yeah, I think also you can contact the program officers for a lot of the federal agencies, and they can either get you, I think they can file the Freedom of Information Act request, or contact PIs on current grants that might be in the same kind of topic area and get you the redacted sort of application. I also think you can contact PIs. I've had people contact me and I'm happy to share grants that I've submitted. So don't be afraid to do that as well. But that can give you a nice, if you don't have something like Amanda's example at your university, there are other ways to kind of see successful submissions for the various places you might be applying.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and maybe some strategic planning. So what are your long-term goals in terms of research and grants? And then, that's going to be really tough to get at first. So what are short-term goals that you can like build up and scaffold to your long-term goals? And I attended a grant development workshop at my university, which was probably the most beneficial thing. So I can share in the chat the different like documents they had us work through, especially some of the initial, like the first week, helping you wrap your head around it and different funders. So I'll add those into the chat.
Awesome. Any follow-up questions on that? So for those of you that are came in kind of after we got started, we were just chatting about how do you get started with pursuing grant funding, thinking about ideas, where do you look, how do you think about really getting over the hurdle of getting going? Okay, if no follow-ups, I'll go on to the next one. How do I gauge if an idea or hypothesis is fundable?
So I think fundability is so like context and funder opportunity specific. So something might be fundable with one agency or RFP that isn't fundable with another. So I think first and foremost, like attending to the RFP. Also exploring like what projects have been funded through a mechanism. I think in general, like of the questions that were submitted, one of the things I'll come back to repeatedly is like talk to people. Like they've mentioned, like you can talk to the program officers, you can reach out to people who've been funded through those mechanisms, you can talk to people who've been reviewers. And the internet is amazing, and you can find all between your university and just general like web searches, you can find all that kind of information. But whenever possible, I think you have like the RFP, but with a lot of the federal agencies, but also increasingly foundations, they do either live or archived webinars to go with their different opportunities. And in a lot of those webinars, they'll discuss like, here's what we're looking to fund. Here is what we are not looking to fund. Like, do not send these things to us. And depending on what it is, they'll also invite you to reach out. And the receptiveness to kind of having kind of like workshopping type conversations varies across the different kind of agencies or foundations you might be interested in. But one thing I've learned from senior folks and from like doing these kind of learning experiences with programs in particular is that one of the like key activities that I think successful grant writers do is that they talk to the program officers, like sending them an email, like, here's what I'm thinking. Do you have any feedback? Setting up meetings. Your university, I mean, outside of a COVID context, but your university might also have funds available to like send you to Washington, DC to meet with program officers. And so talking to people to figure out if it's funded, doing the Freedom of Information Act request for funded proposals, I think is a great thing. But basically like talk to people always.
I agree. Yeah, talking to mentors, other people who've been funded by that foundation, program officer. We did that with the William T. Grant Foundation. After submitting the first time, we talked to a program officer. It was really, really helpful. And I feel like almost anything is fundable if you have like a coherent argument, sound theory, and then an appropriate match in your scope, your funder, your methods. So like it might not be fundable for that organization, but maybe it is for something else, or there's something smaller you can do. So I think a fundability, it's like if you have the right proposal, it could be fundable. It just depends on the source.
Anything you would add, Dave?
I was trying to think of what I could add to Christine Amanda's answer, because I would have said some very similar things. But yeah, I think really reading, especially for foundations, reading the types of projects that they funded in the past, like, you know, the past 2 or 3 years, can give you insight to, you know, what they're looking for and help translate the sort of broad, you know, like William T. grants of research to practice. You could take that any number of ways, but if you see the types of projects that they funded in the past, that might give you a sense of like, would they be interested in this mixed method study or some other approach? So I would probably start there.
I would add to attending to reports and white papers and presentations that the leadership has done, maybe not specific to that mechanism, but both in the case of like federal agencies, but foundations as well. They often put out, when leadership changes, they often put out some kind of publication that articulates their vision and their hopes for what's going to be funded. And so like if I'm working with somebody, or like when I was applying for like the Foundation for Child Development, they had a changeover in the leadership. And as part of that, they had put out like white papers and presentations on like, here's our vision for how we're going to use how we're going to allocate funding for the next 10 years or whatever. And so reading those kind of materials can give you insight both into like their priorities, but how they are responding to problems, like what the theoretical, methodological, substantive bases, what kind of specific like bodies of research that they are grounding kind of their frame on, which to the extent you're able to, gearing your things to include that. I would also take advantage anytime you have the opportunity to get feedback from really the most knowledgeable and also harshest people possible, I would do that. And so like one conference that I had gone to for early career folks that Robert Wood Johnson had done had like asked for people to volunteer to have their rejected proposal reviewed by a panel of was program officers and folks who had repeated funding from like NIH. And they didn't get a lot of volunteers, and they shredded the proposals, but like those people walked away with like a half a dozen program officers and highly funded scholars saying, this is how you need to change your idea and what you've crafted to be fundable. And again, depending on kind of your university's infrastructure or different centers or even associations you're linked up with, those kind of opportunities might exist. And I think it can be hard, especially as a junior person, to want to like put your work out there specifically to get critiqued, particularly in a public venue. Because I've also seen it done at like conference sessions where they take a rejected proposal and review it, or a funded proposal and review it. And you realize that even when something's funded, there's like a huge amount of criticism. But being willing to like put yourself out there to get the kind of feedback, I think can be really helpful. And also really efficient, because you're basically getting what you could do if you submitted it. And depending on what you're submitting to, it can take anywhere from like a quarter to a year or more to get the feedback, but you can get it in the span of a couple weeks or a couple months. And so kind of like fast track your trajectory to actually getting the money you need to do the work you want to do.
And I think also having people review it who aren't familiar with the field or your work, bring a fresh perspective, because sometimes the reviewers have a wide variety of, previous knowledge or experience or training on your topic. So, get people who are really smart and knowledgeable on it, but also people who come from a different field or background, and they can point out some things you wouldn't even think about. And I just shared in that grant development, we did a lot of like peer review. So I just shared like an example of one of those on the project background of like what we went through for it. So not as helpful as some of the other things. I would be scared for some of the things that you talked about at the conference, but I think it would be really beneficial.
I was just going to say I think to Kristy and Amanda's points that I have sent parts of grants to project officers after meeting with them initially, and sent parts of what I've written and have them look at it, and they've provided feedback, which has been insanely helpful, because then, like to Amanda's point, they can say, yes, this is going to fit, or you're making a good argument here, but you're not quite hitting on what we're looking for, or that kind of thing. And to Amanda's point, it might not feel good, but better to get that, within a week than to wait 9 months or whatever it might be. And getting connected with, even though I haven't been funded by IES, I've connected with several project officers and have now had them send me things, even though I've not actually worked with them in the long run because I haven't actually been funded. But just like getting your name out there, I think, is another helpful thing to be thinking about.
And to Kristy's point, I think just sharing your ideas and getting feedback from people, like, again, go outside of like the people closest to you, because it's very unlikely that somebody with that particular knowledge base is going to be among your reviewers. But seek as much critical, like, don't send it to somebody you know is going to be like, this is great, I love it, you deserve this money. No, they are like the most unhelpful. Like, if you need a cheerleader, that's fine. That is not the person you send your material to get critical feedback. You want the most critical feedback you can get. And so whether that's from somebody in your existing network, or making an ask and like introducing yourself to somebody you don't know, or using the mechanisms that exist within your university, like, get as many eyes on it as possible. I don't think like anybody should ever be preparing a proposal that the only person who's looking at it is them and their team, like, at all.
And that might get to something later, but plan early for that. That's something I don't always do well, especially on the first round of submitting something. Like, you really have to build in a lot of extra time for that feedback. And it's really hard to do. So when you're like doing your planning, plan a month early to get things out and feedback, or even earlier. I don't know what others would recommend. I know I never do it early enough. So plan extra time for that.
Lots of really awesome points there. Any follow-up questions you guys have to the various points made? Okay, let's see. So you guys have kind of touched on this a little bit, I think, but how do I know if a funding mechanism is the right fit for my idea? So we've talked about, how do I know if my idea is fundable? Kind of thinking it maybe a little bit in the opposite direction.
Also, again, I think it goes like back to really dissecting the materials. So starting with the RFP, making sure it's clearly aligned with your needs, but also those related materials. Again, like the webinars, the presentations, the footnotes, the references and links and whatnot, what they funded through that mechanism previously. I think one thing that can be helpful, whether you're doing it independently or in collaboration with staff at your university, is to think about what kind of both opportunities and funding you need. And then there's so many different databases that exist now where you can put in your specific criteria, whether it's like the funding levels, or do you want to have like an early career development component to it, or mentoring and that kind of thing. And you can find those things that ostensibly fit those particular needs. And so I encourage doing that, just because I think it's hard to like understand the university of opportunities. But then also, again, talking to people. And this is a great, like, for that particular question of how do you know if the mechanism is a good fit, program officers will be very explicit with you about whether that's the case. And so reaching out to them again is like, for a lot of the questions that were submitted, that's like a recommendation, is like, don't be afraid to talk to the program officer. That's literally part of what they're there to do.
How about switching gears a little bit? How do you get a big grant when you don't have a history of grant funding?
So I thought, and getting these questions ahead of time, I thought maybe the most about this one. So I think there are a couple different things I'd suggest. First is, if you're interested in submitting to IES, IES also has several different training or research training programs that they offer. So there's a Single Case Design Institute. There's one on meta-analysis. There's one on cost-effective analyses. And I think they just funded one on implementation science. and they're usually, they pay for, your airfare to a place. I mean, maybe most of them are going to be virtual this summer, but so there's very little out-of-pocket costs. And that can be helpful in just saying, like, you've been trained, even if you're, not proposing a meta-analysis. I think it's helpful to say that you've had training from IES if you're planning on submitting there. But maybe the bigger thing is, and I've gotten this feedback, you're going to need someone on the grant who IES or the panel is comfortable saying, this person can help you manage it. So I think as an early career person, if you have senior faculty, institution that can be consultants or, very small percentage, that can be helpful, even if they don't help with the proposal or actually help with the project, which I've had that happen to me. I still needed someone, on the grant who I could say, this person has had this kind of funding before, and, they'll be available to help if I had questions. So I think the consultant role can be helpful. And I would say, even with reaching out to program officers as well, just, I guess be comfortable with them. Maybe like one consultant might say no, but just reach out to anyone in the area that you think might be a good fit. Whether or not you have a personal relationship, it would probably be helpful if you knew someone who knew that person. But I would imagine senior folks are pretty used to getting that sort of request. So yeah, if you're an early career person, I don't think that's a barrier, but they would want you to have someone on your project that has some experience.
Well, and I would kind of ask, what does big mean? Because I think everything depends, and sometimes when people say that, they mean different things. And what it takes to be like competitive for a particular mechanism is going to be very like dependent on both the like agency context and the particular requirements for the grant, and to a certain extent also like the review panels, because I've been on review panels where the expectations are very different than what they are at the people like right down the hallway reviewing for a slightly different topic area. But I would start with like, what do you actually need to do the work that you're passionate about? And also like why, if you need the funding to do it, like what are your tenure and promotion expectations? So if you're in a place that has articulated really concrete expectations for the type of funding that people need to have, I think knowing what that end goal is and then what a reasonable trajectory is really important. So for a lot of grants, your previous research experience and how that's documented from trainings to dissemination, and particularly peer-reviewed publications, can be really important, because for a lot of mechanisms, particularly the larger amounts, like getting somebody to give you several $100,000 or $1 million+ when you don't have kind of those tangible products to demonstrate that you can carry out this work to like that like terminal outcome is going to be one of the biggest things that like prevents you from being competitive. In addition to the team, if you're trying to be the PI or the co-PI, you can also think about like starting small to like build your record. So going after the internal pots of money, going after the different early career or startup grants available through professional associations, going for different early career grants, even at like the federal levels, to prove that you can actually implement and carry out a project, manage smaller projects yourself, or you could join a team in a supportive role, right? And work your way up through those different experiences. Or again, depending on the mechanism, like having consultants might be sufficient, or you might need to have a co-PI who's senior. And there's a variety of considerations that go into that. But one of the things to think about is like, how are you actually accounting for people's roles, time, and funding? So like if you're going to have somebody on and you're going to say they're helping you manage it, you have to pay for their time. And for certain senior people's time, that costs a whole lot more than like you might spend as much for their time as you would if you just went for a smaller pot of money yourself, as like startup or early career funds, and going that way. So I think I would kind of start with like, what is the work you actually want to be doing? Like, are you chasing big grants because you think you need to do it? And do you know you need to do it because you've actually like read your tenure code and talked to people about what you need to do to like keep your job or get the job you want and that kind of thing? And then right size your efforts to that. those two things, what you want to do and what you are expected to do.
Yeah, and I agree with starting small, building up, getting that practice managing grants because it's more work than you think, and partnering with others. So, who can you collaborate with? Do they have a record of getting grant funding? Are there centers at your university that you can work with? Often, maybe they've had different grant funds. And maybe grant funders go to them. So then they want someone with your expertise. And even just being a consultant on a grant can, help and be a good initial activity. So yeah, I agree with everything that was said. And Lisa had a question about advisory board members. Is that for grants? Hi, Lisa.
Hi, sorry, I was eating. So I was wondering when David was talking about, having folks on your like immediate team, it sounded like, but then I'm also wondering, like, some grants require like an advisory board panel or whatever. So would it be just as advantageous to have folks with similar types of skills on the advisory board as well in different areas? So if that makes sense, that's kind of what I was wondering.
I really think it depends on what their role is supposed to be. So if you're talking about like an advisory board, like you want to be really explicit about what everybody's roles are. But if you need a senior person on for that project management feature of it, like an advisory board, unless you're meeting like, I don't know that well, maybe the other panelists have different thoughts. I think that in general, if you expect somebody if you're going to say that they're providing the leadership on the grant, you need to incorporate them with sufficient like FTE to do that. Because like I've sat on panels where somebody's like, oh, I'm going to put these big names on my grant at like 0.5% FTE or 1% FTE. And it's like, well, that's not enough to support their engagement and actually helping you to manage like this multi-year large scale project. And also because we can see on their like the stuff they submit, they're already like 200% FTE allocated for the time of the grant. So like they're not going to do anything for you. But again, it goes back to like the mechanism and what the expectations are.
I'll switch gears a little bit if there's no other follow-up questions. What types of grants are available for folks who are not at R1 universities?
So different early career or national organizations often have different funding opportunities that can be good to look at. SAMHSA is one. They funded several projects at Miami University. So that is a good one. State departments, they have funded us a lot. So connect with different state departments, and people already have existing relationships. So like they would have never given me that grant, but I had relationships with others at the university who have that. And then foundations, I hear a lot from our grant facilitator, like faculty are often chasing the foundation funding and, striking out a lot, but sometimes they can be a good avenue. So I think it's good to look at and think about your time that you're putting in, because you often have more teaching expectations also.
I think too, thinking about, unless it's a project that like is something that you would be reasonably doing by yourself, collaborating with people and doing like partnerships across different types of universities. This is another good one where I think talking to a program officer also can be helpful. Like don't necessarily assume that because your university hasn't had this type of funding, it's impossible. Like reach out to them. Sometimes they will say like you're not at a place with the infrastructure for that. Like one of my most like vivid recollections from a panel that I participated in was like this program officer, which I won't say the agency because it was enough years ago that I'm hoping that it's still not true. But this person was talking about their idea and what they wanted to do and mentioned like what kind of school they were at. And they're like, well, honestly, you should probably change universities. But if you're not going to do that, you need a co-PI at a different type of institution and for the grant to run through that. And I was like, wow, that is a horrible thing to hear as like a 4th or 5th year assistant professor in a place that maybe she loves being there, right? But there are times when they will be really explicit, because I was shocked she would say that out loud in a space of like a couple hundred people, but she did. And I mean, she's still there. I did Google her before this session. So,
I think Kristy raised a lot of good points too about thinking about, I mean, I don't know about you guys in grad school, but I didn't think about, you know, funding through like State Department of Education and those types of pieces, and think about internal funding. I have found to be a really helpful starting place. If there's opportunities for internal funding at your university, can be super helpful. And you might be surprised by how, in thinking about our last question related to big grants, you might be surprised by how big some of the internal funding mechanisms can be at different types of universities, which can be really, really helpful.
I would recommend, again, like thinking about either the sponsored projects office at your university, or like if there's deans for research or something, meeting with them, looking at kind of the different types of, again, databases you have access to. And some of them are very explicit about the types of institutions or requirements for that. And there are also like specific types where like you're actually going to be better positioned to get it than some of us, because you might get extra points for being at like a previously unfunded institution or college and that kind of thing. And so those especially, like, go for it. Like, we actually had a thing here recently within OSEP where we were trying to decide if we wanted to try for something. And because of the point structure used in scoring the proposals, we basically decided, why bother? Because you get so many points for being at a previously unfunded institution. And we have, like, at the time I had 3 active, and there were at least 3 other active grants that I knew of just like within my like office suites. And I was like, well, that's, the points will not gain on that are so far below like the points that we've gotten on previous funded proposals. I'm just gonna like take the summer off from that and not do that. And so I guess don't assume that you're not fundable because it hasn't been funded previously. Like, talk to people. And again, email a program officer, schedule a call. If you get a really candid one, that will be super helpful to you.
So maybe switching gears a little bit to kind of logistics and writing practices. As a first year or maybe early career tenure track faculty member, how much time should someone allocate to grant writing?
How much money do you need to do the work you need to do? And how much does having funding factor into your promotion and tenure? Because if you don't need the money and it's not going to allow you to keep your job, why would you spend time on it? It's hugely time intensive. Like here, like things basically shut down. Well, not shut down, but for the people who are really active in getting grants, which I'll admit I don't consider myself one of those folks, the amount of time they spend in the summers around IES deadlines is like very illuminating, but also not something I've chosen to do, obviously. But if you need the funding to do the work you want to do, like that should be the driver. Like chasing funding just because you think you need to have it. Like I've done it and I've gotten grants and I've been miserable for the duration of grants and resentful the whole time I'm writing the publications. And so I wouldn't encourage it unless you like actually need it to do the work that you actually want to do. And recognizing too, depending on where you're at, you might also need it to keep the job that you want or to get the job that you want. But I think you should right size your effort allocation to those two things, your desire and the importance to your actual continual like productivity or employment.
I think we have a here from Kristy.
Like read your tenure code. Don't assume you have to, like if just one senior faculty says something, you need to get multiple sources of data, but your first source of data should be your tenure code. And so like if you think you have to get grants to get tenure, how about you verify that? And there are people in this call who I have like told to read their tenure code and like, but so read the tenure code, talk to your administrative leadership, whatever the infrastructure of your university is, particularly for your smaller universities. Like Is that like a central administrator over tenure and promotion? Is it college department or like unit folks? Talk to them, talk to multiple people who will be voting on your case. Again, that differs depending on where you are. Sometimes it's a senior faculty in your unit. Sometimes there's some kind of college committee. Find out who's been on that committee, talk to those people, look at CVs for folks who've been recently tenured, talk to recently tenured faculty about the type of feedback they've gotten. Don't just think you have to write grants for the sake of writing grants or getting funding for the sake of getting funding. Figure out like what you actually want to do and what you need to do.
I think my department chair, I agree with all of that. And I attended another session with Amanda a couple of years ago. She said all of that and it was very helpful. So yes, I think as many times as you can hear that is good. I know my department chair, when I came in, he said, I don't want you writing a book before tenure. I don't want you applying for grants in your first couple of years. I think I applied for one, it was like a pilot one, maybe second year. But even so, it wasn't as intensive as like an IES grant proposal. It was like a letter of interest. So I think if you can do things like that, where it's a letter of interest and you're not putting in so much work, but they can invite you if they want more. But again, it depends on what you need to do, what your passions are, and what your position requires, and looking at all that. And sometimes maybe they just need you to apply, but seeing what are the expectations.
Yeah, I would add probably 0 your first year. Like I think first year is all about survival. So maybe that first summer, but yeah, with new course preps and just getting used to the faculty role, you're certainly not behind, in my opinion, if you're not writing a grant your first year. Now, if you did a postdoc and you have this fundable idea and it's kind of you're further along, then sure. But I would say like maybe an internal grant that summer, or if there are grants, small grants that you can use to like pay yourself in the summer to do research, that can be really helpful, and also kind of build your CV in terms of just showing that you can obtain funding, even if it's, I think my first internal grant was $7,500 or something like that, or $15,000 over 2 years. So that didn't take as nearly as much time, obviously, but that was kind of, I think, an appropriate like second year task, because writing one IES grant takes pretty much the entire summer, and you could use that time to write papers that you'll need to get tenure, or relax and recharge after your first year or two. So yeah, I certainly don't think you need to be spending any time on the first year, just because it's such a thin schedule of reinforcement.
Yeah, and I mean, if you need funding to do the work you want to do, go for the internal stuff, or even like professional associations or like foundation small pots that don't require a lot of prep. There is something so fundamentally different in putting together a 1-page letter or a 5-page proposal from doing an IES proposal, right? In terms of just the sheer amount of effort, but also the level of detail, the flexibility you have, and just like all the sort of freedom and how you use the funds. And so you could spend a couple afternoons preparing for some like internal seed funds. Like we have stuff here in our department that it's like a 1-page form where you like fill out a 1/2-page box on your project, and then you can have a few $1,000s to do something. And so why wouldn't you spend the 2 hours on that versus the hundreds of hours time to most likely get reviewed? Because like one of the biggest things, one thing that stood out to me, like when I came to Minnesota, because there's a lot of people here who have a lot of large grants always, and will have tens of millions over the course of their careers. But if they operate from the assumption that they're going to get rejected 3 to 5 times before something hits, and you can estimate like a year to a year and a half for each cycle of those 3 to 5 times, you don't have time for that pre-tenure to be putting all of your kind of eggs in that particular basket. Versus if you either diversify or start with the easier pots of money, and usually those are internal, and there are some that like you just get for trying, versus some foundations, like 2 to 5% of proposals are funded. It's actually, with a lot of the federal agencies, you have a higher likelihood of getting funded than you do in some of the foundations. But yeah, think about like investment, like the cost benefits analysis on your time and your professional trajectory.
And I find the internal research proposals beneficial just to write and conceptualize something. Like, so yeah, if you can do that in your first 3 years, get some internal funds that will help you think more critically, decide what you want to do, get some initial findings. And then if you can talk about that pilot work and, you know, your findings on a letter of interest and then build up from there. But yeah, I would expect to get rejected if you're doing one of the big funders right away.
What strategies have worked well for you guys in setting up a grant writing workflow?
So I signed up for that grant development workshop. It could be cool if we did something like that in school psychology. Because that was so helpful. Like each week you had homework and you had to, you know, work on a part of the proposal, and they gave you resources for that. So that I liked a lot. Working with others, I don't get anything done unless I'm, you know, have partners, collaborators, and we set accountability deadlines. And then setting those deadlines, building in time in the calendar. But I haven't done some of the extensive proposals, so I'm curious what others recommend.
So I think the RFP for IES, and I'm sorry that I have to focus solely on this, but that agency, but they usually come out in May, and then May or June, and then the proposals due end of August-ish, right? So I think my colleagues and I, we usually have like our idea somewhat hammered out before then. So we're not, you know, really spinning our wheels once we know what the RFP will look like. But then trying to divide and conquer, right? So if you're maybe not, you don't have the quantitative skills, or you do it and you don't have the more substantive area content expertise, you can divide that up amongst your team. So everybody has a part, but then whoever's PI is kind of playing with the point person. So yeah, I can't imagine getting one done start to finish by yourself. So I think maybe having your idea in mind before that call comes out, and then once it does, you can sort of chop up the 30-page application into more manageable, discrete parts, which I think makes it quite a bit easier.
I think people should always start early, right? And earlier than you would think. Like I remember one of the workshops that I did, they said you should be starting 6 to 9 months in advance. And that kind of blew my mind, because at the time I was like, I have no idea how to do that. But you can like subscribe to forecasts for like if you're interested in different federal funds, you can get forecasts. So like they'll tell you, like you can get emails like in advance of like this thing is due in the next couple months, or you can just pay attention on like all the different things, like listservs you can subscribe to, look historically as well, because for certain agencies or foundations, things are on a reoccurring basis. And so you can plan ahead for that, while expecting that maybe the RFP will look a little different in a given year, especially again, if there's leadership changes. But I think in general, starting earlier, this is something that's like super Googleable. And so people have different different like Gantt charts and different like project charts, like that you like for different mechanisms that they like mapped out, like what are all the different sub-steps that go into writing for this particular proposal, and how much time can you expect to spend on it, and then like you basically backwards plan from that, making sure, like Kristy mentioned, building in time for the review. So not just by the people on your team, but by those external folks, and making appointments like ahead of time, like, hey, can I send this thing to you in 6 weeks? And then can you get it back to me on whatever date? Or if I need this back to you on whatever date, when do I need to get it from you? And building all of those kind of things in on the front end, so that you have, again, critical eyes on your proposal well before you turn it in, until you get into like a rotation, right? Or like you've got like day where you just probably have like you've got a kind of a system built, right? But especially early on, you need to get that feedback, or be prepared to, if you're going to rely on the rejections to be your feedback, that's just, like I said, a lot slower.
And think about your grant administrative system at your university. So ours is called like ESPA or something like that. And it's not very easy to learn. It like just takes a lot of focus, and you have to, connect with others. And, there's kind of a process for getting everything in there, getting it approved. So I don't think I quite realized the extent of time that would take. So, talking to others who've applied for grants at your university.
Yeah, so most of you, particularly at like universities with sponsored projects offices, you won't be the person submitting your large grants. You might for early career grants or like startup funds, like from professional associations or something, but a lot of times you have to go through your university infrastructure. And that usually means you actually have to have everything done earlier than the actual due date. So if you're working with the actual due date that's printed on the RFP as your terminal deadline, you're going to be late. And depending on how flexible your university is, they might just not accept your proposal in that cycle, and you might have to wait until next time. And so if you don't plan ahead, you wouldn't know that. Like I was talking to a junior person recently, and they were like looking for some deadline. I was like, well, what's your sponsored project office deadline? And like, I don't know, that this is the deadline for the thing. I'm like, you need to find out when you need to have that done, because generally I think you need to subtract like at least a week, potentially more, because I know at some institutions it's more like 2 or 3 weeks. And in faculty time, that's months worth of effort, right?
That's a good point. It made me think about, and also learning what are the little, intricacies of your grants office if you have one, and, you have personalities in there too, and figure out what are the things that they like and what they want, and try to work within that system. Because when you're when you can get in on the good side, and then if you do struggle to maybe get something in right at when they want it, and maybe they can help you out a little bit. Not that I know anyone with that experience, but just a suggestion if you ever find yourself in that position. Get in the good side, bring candy if you need to. Another question, what I know, Amanda, you've reviewed before. I don't know, Dave or Kristy, if you guys have, but maybe for feedback too, what are common mistakes that you have seen or feedback that you've gotten around in grant writing or proposals?
Follow the directions, please. The easiest, like you can be disregarded without review if you don't follow the directions. Because for some agencies, it's like if your margins aren't right, if your font's not right, you're gonna go right into like the metaphorical trash bin, like without consideration. But if you do make it to review, like follow the directions and align your proposal with the selection criteria, and attend to the fact that sometimes what they say the requirements are and what the selection criteria don't map on. And so you want to make it really explicit so that when somebody's looking at your grant, they can discern very easily like how you meet whatever the criteria are. Don't make people work for it. I generally say like people, like if I have 30 things in my queue to review and half of them don't follow the directions, regardless of the quality of the idea, I may not even be able to score them well because of the way the point systems are broken down. So like for like the OSEP grants, for instance, like there's like 100 points possible, I think, and then you can get extra points for certain things, but like that, like I've put in like multiple proposals in a year, and literally the difference in being funded and not is like 1 to 2 points out of that 100. And so you want to make sure you're following the directions and the criteria really clearly, because that will make the difference in whether you have the money to do what you need or not.
That's the big one I've heard, following the directions and double checking all of that. Also, I mean, a mismatch between your research questions and your methods and methodology and what they're looking for with methodology. That's the other one. When we talked to William T. Grant Foundation, the program officer, that's the one she kept mentioning is the big one she sees concerns with in general.
Yeah, make sure your methodology can answer your question. That's like a surprisingly common mistake where the research questions are over here, the actual study described is over here, and then what you expect to do with your findings is in some other area. And so part of like having people look at it, particularly people who aren't super familiar with their area, can be really helpful there. But yeah, read the directions and make sure that all of the elements, regardless of whether you're doing a study or a training grant or anything, make sure they align, because any misalignment is going to be like bump you out right away.
I haven't reviewed too many. I was like an ad hoc reviewer last year. But one piece of advice I was given that may relate to this is like you need to tell the reviewer within the first paragraph or two what your project is and why it's important, and keep revisiting that throughout. So because if they do have 30 in their queue, right, that they're triaging them in their mind as they're reading through them. But really like making sure your message is consistent, which is something I think someone who's not familiar with the work will immediately pick up on if you're all over the place, whereas someone who knows your work and knows the area and can like draw those inferences in between what you're saying much easier, such as like a reviewer for a manuscript, for example. If you can get someone to look at it who doesn't have that shared background information, they might just say, I don't understand how you went from A to B here. And kind of avoiding those gaps in your logic, or I guess gaps in your argument, can go a long way.
So I think also starting out from the assumption that grant writing is different than manuscript writing. If you write a grant the right way, if you have like a traditional manuscript writing style, nobody's gonna like, I would honestly quit within the first couple pages, because if I need to get to like the third section of your proposal to figure out what in the world you're doing, and I have hundreds, if not thousands of pages in my bin, I'm not going to do it. And I'll just be like the grouchy senior person who's like, if you make me work harder than I think you worked on it to figure out what you're doing, like why? And so I think like all the different grant workshops, and like there's a ton of books, and like one book that I really like that I use with my students is it actually comes out of the hard sciences, but it's called Writing Science, and like teaching people to write really directly and really concisely, because it's a fundamentally different kind of approach than what a lot of people are socialized into in writing manuscripts. And so I think modifying your style to your audience is really important. And again, telling people early and repeatedly exactly what you're doing and why. And so like something I started doing with my students, even for manuscripts, because like I've generalized my grouchiness to all forms of writing, is like tell people right in the beginning of your paper, your chapter, whatever you're writing, what you're doing and why it's important. But that's especially important in a grant context, where a lot of times like there's going to be triaging and things that happen, and you don't want to be triaged out.
I'm getting so much out of this. I'm like writing notes as we're going along. So yeah, that's helpful.
The other thing that comes to mind is making sure, especially if you're going for a large grant or you have a team, making sure you've clearly demonstrated with the people involved that you can do the work you're proposing. Like between your CV or your bio sketch and what you put in your narrative, like you need to convince the reviewers that you have the training or experience to do what you're saying you're doing. So whether that's the IES trainings that Dave mentioned, or that you've got publications that clearly show that you've done this work and you can do this work. I know that for certain competitions, if you propose a team and you've never worked together, that can be a negative that's counted against you. And so taking the time to co-author some stuff with each other quickly, or presentations or something to show that like you have the skills and the ability to work together, especially when you talk about like the larger grants, like you have collectively the expertise that you need to do the work. Because none of this is blind, right? So with a couple exceptions of some foundations where initial reviews are blinded. The idea and the people proposing it are of similar importance sometimes. Because I've been on panels where an amazing team with what arguably is not a great idea, but they've got a really strong track record of being able to do good work and disseminate it and create whatever it is they're trying to create, versus a great idea, but no proof that they can carry it out. And the shoddy idea with the amazing team fared better than the great idea with the shoddy team. So make sure, don't assume that you need to make sure that with whatever you're providing, whatever the materials are, that you've made really clear, not only the quality of your idea, but your ability to actually follow through with whatever you proposed.
We have just a few minutes. So does anyone have any questions that have popped up throughout the last hour or so that you want to ask our panelists before we head out? If not, Amanda, I have a question for you. There was some interest in OSEP funding, and I know you've had success with OSEP funding. I think just around like what's the intention of those funding mechanisms, generally speaking, and maybe if you can just kind of speak to those, maybe some of the success that you've had with those.
Yeah, so I went for those when I was junior, and one of the conversations I had with a program officer shortly after my second rejection was, it doesn't really matter what the quality of your idea is. As an assistant professor with no senior people, we're not going to fund you. And I was like, sweet, let me add on a senior person, which wasn't actually, anyways. They're for reducing personnel shortages or faculty shortages in special ed and related services. And so the ones that I've had have been for reducing shortages of school psychologists with focus on skills around MTSS and MTSS for learning difficulties. So it's all like, so what I do with all of ours is to ground it really concretely in the work that we're already doing within our program. So we don't usually, it's not something like it might be novel within OSEP, it's not novel for our program. They're honestly like the thing that I think that was the game changer besides getting tenure. Although again, if you have a senior person in your program or department who could be co-PI, that would be different. I did an FOI for somebody who had like for decades had these, that was just like what they had in their program for eternities. And I did an FOI because the person wasn't able to provide them because the person had passed. Anyways, when I saw theirs, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like, I would not have expected certain things based on what was in the RFP. And so I really took that to heart in terms of like the types of tables and figures and the way I organize things and like that kind of thing. And that's where like not necessarily, there's the directions and then there's the selection criteria, and embedding all the selection criteria, for instance, as subheadings. That wasn't intuitive, but I think it just made things really easy for the reviewers. And so don't plan it as a research thing, because there are specific, like within the footnotes, you'll see that like this is to provide for training. And so if that's what you want to do, great, but follow their directions and the selection criteria and read their footnotes and all of that. And the webinars, like they do webinars on like their stuff now, it's all there on the project websites. And so I would definitely like review all of that stuff.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Kristy and Dave. It's 4, so, well, it's 4 where I am. I don't know if it's 4 where you guys are. So I don't want to keep you guys, but this will be posted to our ECF YouTube channel. So we'll send out notification with the link and everything, so that if folks want to go back and check it out, you can do so. And Amanda, you have a follow-up question about OSEP grants in the chat.
School psychologists are one of the eligible areas. So it's special education and related services. So all that entails.
So anything that says special education or related services, we would be eligible for if we were to try and write a training grant for the most part.
Yeah, it's the 325K program.
325K, writing that down.
Google 84.325K. It'll take you to the personnel training grants. The 325D is for faculty prep.
Great, thank you so much. That's what we need. We're struggling with recruitment because our students can't afford to go to graduate school in rural Louisiana. So
yeah, and that would be a really strong hook because there are severe shortages, and there are extremely severe shortages in rural areas, because part of it you have to show need. And so
we've got need. Thank you all for all this information. It's been very helpful.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Appreciate you all coming and submitting and asking questions.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thank you, Kristy, Amanda, and Dave.